The most powerful military alliance in modern history collapses not because of an external enemy, but because one of its own members decides to take a vast, frozen island from another ally. That is no longer a hypothetical question. Donald Trump has openly said he wants Greenland. The White House has confirmed that all options are on the table, including force. Greenland has just 58,000 people, no army of its own, limited Danish defenses, and a permanent US military presence already on its soil. On paper, this looks easy. In reality, it could shatter NATO, upend international law, and redraw the rules of global power in the Arctic. I want you to pause here. If this feels unthinkable, that is exactly why it matters. Because history often breaks at the point where the unthinkable becomes plausible. If you want to understand how power really works in the 21st century, stay with me. Now let's step back and define what this crisis is actually about. What is actually at stake here is not a land grab in the old imperial sense. It is a collision between three forces that rarely meet so directly: raw military power, international law, and the will of a small population caught between giants. From Washington's perspective, Greenland is framed as a security asset, an Arctic outpost, a strategic shield, a place already hosting a US base, already tied into American defense planning. From Copenhagen's perspective, Greenland is sovereign territory, defended by treaty, protected by NATO, and embedded in a rules-based order that has kept peace among allies for decades. And from Nuuk's perspective, the story is different again. Greenland is not a chessboard square. It is a society of 58,000 people, many of whom want independence from Denmark but not absorption into the United States. That contradiction is the heart of this crisis. The US may have power. Denmark has law. Greenlanders have identity. And history shows that when these three pull in opposite directions, something eventually gives. To understand why this tension exists at all, we have to go back into history, geography, and the logic of the Arctic itself. To understand how Greenland ended up at the center of a 21st century power struggle, you have to strip away today's headlines and look at the deeper forces that shaped it. Greenland's strategic value was never about its people. It was about its position, a massive island sitting between North America and Europe, guarding the Arctic routes that connect them. During World War II, when Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the United States moved in not to conquer, but to prevent others from doing so. Military and radio stations were established. A logic was born. Greenland mattered when great powers feared each other. That logic never disappeared. It simply went dormant. The Cold War kept Greenland inside an American security umbrella. After the Soviet collapse, the Arctic faded from public attention. But geography does not change, even when politics does. As ice melts and Arctic routes reopen, the island's old relevance snaps back into focus. Defense planners start thinking in maps and corridors again. Security once more becomes about distance, early warning, and control. Greenland did not suddenly become important. It always was. The question now is how that strategic logic collides with a modern world built on alliances, law, and self-determination. The first real shock comes when theory turns into operational reality. Defense analysts say a rapid US operation to take Greenland could be executed with stunning speed, not because Greenland is weak, but because it is vast, thinly populated, and largely undefended. There is no Greenlandic army. Denmark is responsible for defense, yet it has limited air and naval assets spread across an enormous territory. Large areas are policed by the Sirius Patrol elite Danish units moving by dog sled across ice. Against that, the United States has overwhelming capability. More than 100 US troops are already stationed at the Pituffik base in Greenland's northwest, a facility that could, in theory, become a logistical hub overnight. Experts point to the Alaska-based 11th Airborne Division, Arctic-trained brigades. Airlift capacity strong enough to deploy forces at a scale that dwarfs the local population. One analyst put it bluntly, you could fly in enough troops to outnumber civilians in a single lift. It might be ruthless, it might even be bloodless, but it would trigger something far larger than a military operation. Because the moment one NATO member moves against another, the alliance itself enters uncharted territory. And that is where the real danger begins. What makes this crisis truly dangerous is not the troops or the aircraft. It is the machinery behind them, the system that decides when force becomes necessary. From a purely military perspective, Greenland looks like a low-resistance target. Small population, no standing army, limited Danish presence across a massive landmass. But power does not operate in a vacuum. An attack by the United States on Greenland would not just be a battlefield decision. It would be a legal, political, and moral rupture. Former US defense officials are blunt about this. Such an act would violate international law. Denmark is not an enemy. It is a treaty ally inside Washington that matters. Any move toward war would face resistance in Congress. Lawmakers could invoke the War Powers Act, designed precisely to stop presidents from launching conflicts without approval. And beyond the US, the shockwaves would be immediate. NATO is built on a simple promise. Allies do not fight each other. Break that rule once, and the alliance's credibility evaporates everywhere else. This is the hidden mechanism of restraint. Not morality alone, but fear of systemic collapse. The paradox is this: the easier Greenland looks to take militarily, the more catastrophic the consequences become. And that is why the White House has spent just as much time exploring non-military paths, which brings us to the second shock. The second shock is quieter but in some ways more destabilizing. Buying Greenland sounds clean. No troops, no tanks, just a transaction. But reality is far messier. Both Nuuk and Copenhagen are clear. Greenland is not for sale. Even if it were, the legal obstacles are immense. Congress would have to appropriate the funds. 2/3 of the US Senate would need to approve a treaty. The European Union would have to sign off, and international law would demand Greenlandic participation in the name of self-determination. This is not a real estate deal. It is a constitutional maze. There is also the politics. Trump ran on America first. The idea of spending billions or trillions of US tax dollars on an ice-covered island could land badly with his own base. Some analysts warn of a more dangerous dynamic. If a purchase fails publicly, it does not close the door. It slams it. And when leaders feel blocked by law, procedure, and institutions, they often look for shortcuts. Pressure replaces patience. Force begins to look simpler than consent. One expert put it starkly. After failure, a president might simply say, "We'll take it." But before force, there is one more path, subtler, slower, and harder to see. And it runs directly through the people of Greenland themselves. This is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because whatever strategy is chosen, it does not land on maps or treaties. It lands on people. If you live in Greenland, this is not a debate about power projection. It is about your future, your language, your land, your right to decide who you belong to. Opinion polls show many Greenlanders want independence from Denmark, but they do not want to become Americans. That matters, because influence campaigns do not announce themselves. They arrive as promises: short-term money, jobs, security guarantees, a better future framed as inevitable. Reports suggest US intelligence has increased its focus on Greenland's independence movement, looking for voices that might align with Washington's goals. From the outside, this can look pragmatic. From the inside, it feels intrusive. Imagine being told that history has decided for you, that your home is too valuable to remain fully yours. This is the emotional fault line of the crisis. Not tanks, not treaties, but consent If you believe small nations should have a voice in a world of giants, this is where that principle is tested. And if this story matters to you, stay with me, because the consequences do not stop at Greenland's shores. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. If the United States were to force the issue by pressure, coercion, or force, it would send a signal far beyond the Arctic. It would tell allies that treaties are conditional, that sovereignty is negotiable when power is asymmetrical, that security guarantees depend on convenience, not principle. For NATO, this would be existential. The alliance is not held together by tanks or aircraft. It is held together by trust. The belief that Article 5 means something and that members do not prey on each other. For Europe, the shock would be immediate. If Denmark can be overridden, who is next? Small states would start hedging. Strategic autonomy would stop being a slogan and become a survival strategy. And globally, rivals would be watching closely. Russia and China would not need propaganda. They would simply point and say, this is how the West behaves when rules get in the way. The Arctic itself would harden into a militarized frontier. Cooperation would give way to corridors of control. Stability would be replaced by permanent suspicion. Greenland may look remote on the map, but in geopolitical terms, it sits at the center of the system. And when the center shakes, everything connected to it feels the tremor. Which leaves us with the hardest question of all. Where does this road actually lead? Here is where we confront the future three paths, each as plausible as it is unsettling. Scenario 1. The best case. Greenland asserts independence peacefully. The US becomes a partner, not a proprietor. Security arrangements are negotiated. Mineral wealth remains under Greenlandic control. NATO remains intact. Trust survives. Scenario 2. The middle path. The US fails to secure consent. Tensions rise. Diplomatic friction strains alliance. Greenlanders remain under Denmark, but relations with Washington sour. Strategic uncertainty grows across the Arctic. Scenario 3. The worst case. Frustrated by politics and law, a more aggressive administration acts unilaterally. NATO fracture. International law is violated. Greenland becomes a flashpoint in global competition. The Arctic militarizes. Long-term instability spreads far beyond the ice. All three outcomes reveal the same lesson. Raw power is insufficient. Law, identity, and consent constrain action in ways maps cannot show. Geography matters, but so does time. Greenlanders think in centuries, administrations in years. This is the tension at the heart of the crisis. Between ambition and legitimacy, force and consent, short-term gain and long-term consequence. And it is a reminder, the unthinkable may always be imaginable, but the consequences last far longer than any headline. What then should we take away from this frozen island? 2.1 million square kilometers of ice and possibility. Greenland is not simply a strategic asset to be acquired. It is a mirror. It reflects the limits of power, the weight of law, and the enduring will of a people. Donald Trump may dream of taking it, buying it, or influencing it. But no army, no treaty, no campaign can fully override the consent of the inhabitants without shattering alliances and principles that have governed the world for decades. And that is the insight we cannot ignore. Power without legitimacy is fragile. Force without consent is temporary. Ambition without foresight can unravel the very order it seeks to dominate. So what will happen next? That is not for us to predict. But we can watch and learn and understand the forces at work so that when the Arctic trembles, we recognize the stakes. If this story has opened your eyes to the fragility of alliances, the complexity of global power, and the enduring importance of small voices in a world of giants, subscribe and join me for the next analysis, where we will explore another corner of our interconnected, unpredictable planet. because understanding is the first step toward navigating the future, and you deserve to see the world clearly.